Tanks were never meant to be quiet. Every army believed that steel tracks guaranteed noise, that sound was unavoidable, and that armored warfare could never hide its approach. Yet, in late 1944, German panzer units began facing something that shattered that belief. American tanks moving close enough to kill, without the sounds they had been trained to hear, without any warning at all. The most unsettling part wasn't advanced technology or secret engineering, but a simple, dismissed method so ordinary, so overlooked that when it finally worked, the Panzers never heard them coming. If this story already surprised you, subscribe for more untold World War II stories like this one. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps the channel more than you think. For decades before the winter of 1944, one assumption shaped armored warfare more than any technical manual or tactical doctrine. Tanks were loud, not occasionally loud, not situationally loud, inescapably loud. Steel tracks grinding against wheels, pins slamming into links, vibration echoing through frozen air. Noise was not a flaw. It was accepted as a fact. Every army planned around it. Every commander accounted for it. And every soldier on the battlefield learned to listen for it. German armored doctrine treated sound as an early warning system. Long before a tank appeared in sight, it announced itself through rhythm and repetition. A trained observer could distinguish armor from trucks, identify direction, estimate distance, and sometimes even guess unit strength based purely on sound. This was not superstition. It was taught, practiced, and reinforced through years of combat. In North Africa, the sound of tracks carried across open desert. In Italy, it echoed through valleys and hills. In France, it rolled across farmland and villages. By 1944, German forces no longer questioned whether tanks could be heard. The question was only how far away. Acoustic detection had become a quiet pillar of battlefield awareness. Forward observers listened. Infantry units paused at night to detect movement. Artillery crews relied on sound reports to prepare fire missions before armor ever came into view. The belief was so deeply ingrained that no one thought to challenge it. Sound meant certainty, and certainty shaped behavior. German units moved, rested, and repositioned based on what they heard. Silence meant safety. Noise meant contact. This binary understanding simplified chaos. In a war defined by confusion, sound offered clarity. That clarity would become a liability. By late 1944, the Western Front had settled into a tense rhythm. Both sides understood the terrain. Both sides understood each other. Surprise had become rare, especially for armored units. Tanks did not ambush. They advanced, slowly, loudly, predictably, or so everyone believed. Winter intensified everything. Cold air carried sound farther. Frozen ground amplified vibration. In forests like the Ardennes, noise traveled through trees and valleys with unnerving efficiency. German commanders trusted their ears even more as visibility dropped and snow blurred outlines. If tanks moved, they would be heard. If nothing was heard, nothing was moving. This belief shaped confidence. When German patrols reported silence, commanders slept easier. When observers heard nothing during the night, positions were assumed secure. Defensive planning depended on the assumption that armor could not approach undetected. The battlefield had rules. Loud machines obeyed them. On the American side, crews understood the same reality. Tankers knew their machines announced their presence. Night movement was risky. Reconnaissance close to enemy positions was limited. Aggressive maneuvering often waited until daylight when sound mattered less than speed and firepower. Stealth was for infantry. Armor was blunt force. No one expected that to change. And that is what makes what followed so dangerous. Because revolutions in warfare rarely begin with new weapons. They begin when an old belief stops being true, and no one realizes it yet. German forces did not fail because their equipment broke. Their sensors did not malfunction. Their observers were not incompetent. They failed because they were listening for the wrong thing. They were trained to hear steel. They were not trained to question silence. Reports from late December began to reflect a strange pattern. Units described American armor appearing closer than expected. Patrols noted engagement ranges shrinking without warning. Forward observers reported confusion, not absence of sound, but absence of the sounds that mattered. At first, these reports were dismissed: fatigue, weather, human error. War was full of anomalies, and commanders learned quickly which ones to ignore. But the pattern persisted. German units began requesting visual confirmation more frequently. Acoustic reports no longer aligned with contact. Tanks seemed to arrive late, or suddenly, or without the familiar metallic prelude that normally preceded combat. To German doctrine, this made no sense. If tanks were moving, they would be heard. If they were not heard, they were not there. That belief had survived years of war. It had survived multiple theaters, climates, and enemy adaptations. No official directive suggested otherwise. No technical report challenged it. No engineer had ever claimed armored stealth was realistic. Noise was unavoidable. That was the rule. And yet, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not universally, but enough to undermine confidence. The most dangerous moments in war are not when weapons fail, but when assumptions do. German forces did not realize they were losing awareness. They believed the battlefield was quiet, when in reality it had learned to whisper. What made this failure so profound was not its scale, but its invisibility. There was no explosion to mark the change, no captured document announcing a new technique, no intelligence breakthrough revealing an enemy advantage. The battlefield simply stopped behaving the way it was supposed to. And when that happens, soldiers do not immediately blame technology. They blame themselves. Observers questioned their hearing. Commanders questioned reports. Units hesitated, unsure whether silence meant safety or danger. Confidence eroded not through defeat, but through doubt. Meanwhile, American armor was not suddenly silent. Engines still roared, tracks still moved. Physics had not been violated. But something fundamental had changed in how sound behaved, and more importantly, how it was perceived. The German army was listening carefully. They just weren't hearing what mattered anymore. And buried beneath layers of doctrine, engineering assumptions, and institutional certainty was a truth no one had thought to test. Not because it was complex, not because it required innovation, but because it looked too simple to be worth considering. By the time German commanders began to suspect that something had altered the acoustic nature of the battlefield, the advantage was already in motion. Tanks were approaching closer. Patrols were becoming bolder. Engagements were starting on terms the defenders did not expect. The rules had changed quietly. And the most unsettling part was this: the solution was not hidden in secret laboratories or advanced research programs. It was hiding in plain sight, dismissed precisely because it did not look like a weapon. That is where this story actually begins. Not with American ingenuity, not with German failure, but with a belief so universal that no one thought to question it until the moment it stopped being true. The failure did not begin as a tactical mystery. It began as a maintenance problem. On the American side, there was no discussion of silence, stealth, or deception. Tank crews were not trying to disappear. They were trying to keep their vehicles moving. By the winter of 1944, mobility mattered more than elegance. Tanks that could not move were liabilities. Tanks that broke down under fire were coffins. Sherman crews complained constantly about track wear, not dramatically, not in official protests. In the quiet, habitual way, soldiers complain about equipment that fails just often enough to be dangerous. Frozen mud hardened between links. Ice crystals turned small imperfections into grinding edges. Pins loosened, links cracked. Tracks threw themselves at the worst possible moments. None of this was unusual. Every armored unit dealt with it. What made the winter different was how fast it happened. Maintenance logs from late 1944 showed track degradation accelerating beyond projections. Crews who were used to predictable wear patterns suddenly found themselves replacing components earlier, more often, and under worse conditions. Engineers blamed terrain. Commanders blamed usage. Supply blamed weather. No one blamed sound. Noise was not listed as a problem because noise was expected. You could not fix what was considered inherent. Standard lubricants helped, but only marginally. Grease reduced friction, but it washed away. It froze. It collected debris. In cold weather, it stiffened and lost effectiveness. Engineers had already tested these limits. The results were known. There was nothing revolutionary left to try. That assumption shaped behavior. Maintenance crews focused on durability, not acoustics. Engineers focused on longevity, not detection. Doctrine treated noise as unavoidable, and so it never appeared as a variable worth adjusting. This is how blind spots form. The most dangerous problems are not the ones nobody sees. They are the ones everyone sees but classifies incorrectly. Track noise was classified as an operational constant, not a solvable problem. And because it was not considered solvable, it was not studied with curiosity. It was endured. The overlooked truth was simple. The sound did not come from engines alone. It came from friction, metal striking metal, vibration traveling through rigid components, energy turning into noise because nothing was absorbing it. That truth was not secret. It was just uninteresting. In engineering terms, it was mundane. In doctrinal terms, it was irrelevant. Tanks were loud. End of discussion. But war does not care about doctrine. It only cares about outcomes. As American armored units prepared for winter operations, maintenance became improvisation. Crews used whatever they had, whatever worked, whatever extended track life long enough to survive the next movement. Nobody was innovating. They were coping. And coping creates opportunities. Field maintenance has always existed in the shadow of formal engineering. It is where specifications loosen and practicality takes over. Soldiers do not ask whether something is approved. They ask whether it helps. That mindset is dangerous to systems built on rules. It is also where many battlefield shifts begin. No one set out to redesign armored warfare. No one wrote a proposal. No one ran simulations. There was no breakthrough moment where someone declared a discovery. There was only frustration, tracks that wore too fast, noise that carried too far, equipment that behaved exactly as it always had, except now the cost of that behavior was rising. What changed was not intention, it was pressure. Pressure forces attention into places doctrine ignores. At some point, maintenance crews noticed something subtle. Not a dramatic silence, not a revelation, just a difference in how metal felt after certain treatments, a change in texture, a reduction in resistance, a smoother interaction between components that normally punished each other. These observations did not look important. They were not framed as tactical advantages. They were not even framed as solutions. They were practical notes made by people trying to survive winter. The critical mistake German doctrine made was assuming innovation only comes from engineers. In reality, innovation often comes from people with no interest in theory and no patience for approval. American field maintenance was not trying to deceive the enemy. It was trying to keep machines alive. Any effect beyond that was incidental. That distinction matters, because when an effect is incidental, no one advertises it, no one documents it properly, no one warns the enemy that the rules are changing. German forces were listening for a known sound profile. They trusted their training. They trusted the consistency of physics. Steel was steel. Noise was noise. What they did not consider was that the sound they were trained to hear depended on assumptions about friction, vibration, and resonance that no one had ever tried to disrupt in this way. Not because it was impossible, because it was boring. In military research, boring ideas die early. They do not promise breakthroughs. They do not justify funding. They do not look impressive in reports. But on the battlefield, boring ideas can be lethal. The overlooked problem was never noise itself. It was the belief that noise could not be meaningfully altered without complex engineering, rubber padding, specialized materials, industrial redesigns, all expensive, all slow, all unrealistic during wartime. No one asked whether something simple could change the sound profile enough to matter. And that is the key phrase. Enough to matter. Perfect silence was never required. The battlefield does not demand perfection. It demands advantage. German acoustic detection relied on pattern recognition. Observers listened for specific tonal qualities, sharp impacts, metallic rhythms, familiar signatures that cut through ambient noise. Change those signatures, even slightly, and certainty collapses. The American side did not understand this at first. They were not trying to disrupt enemy perception. They were unknowingly doing something far more dangerous. They were altering the battlefield without announcing it. As winter operations intensified, American armor began moving differently. Not faster, not more aggressively, just closer. Patrols crept nearer to enemy positions without triggering expected responses. Engagement distances shortened. Surprise increased. At first, these results were attributed to weather. Snow dampened sound. Wind shifted acoustics. Forests absorbed noise. These explanations were reasonable. They were also incomplete. What made the situation unique was not environment alone. Similar conditions had existed before. Yet this time, something else was amplifying the effect. German units did not immediately panic. They adapted as they always had. They requested confirmation. They relied more heavily on visual cues. They assumed the problem lay in observation, not doctrine. They were wrong, because the battlefield was no longer behaving the way their training said it should. And when training fails, hesitation follows. Hesitation costs time. Time costs lives. The overlooked problem was not that tanks were loud. It was that everyone believed they always would be. That belief filtered what was tested, what was ignored, and what was considered impossible. Somewhere between maintenance, improvisation, and battlefield consequence, that belief cracked. Not loudly, quietly. And by the time anyone thought to ask whether sound itself could be manipulated without redesigning the machine, the answer was already moving through forests, across frozen ground, and into positions where it should never have arrived undetected. The solution did not announce itself. It did not look like a weapon. And that is exactly why no one was prepared for what came next. The change did not arrive with an announcement. There was no moment when American commanders declared a new tactic or issued revised doctrine. What happened instead was far more dangerous. The battlefield began behaving differently, and no one could immediately explain why. German units noticed it first, but only in fragments. A patrol passed closer than expected without triggering response. An observation post failed to report movement that should have been unmistakable. An engagement began at a distance that made no sense. These were not dramatic failures. They were subtle misalignments between expectation and reality, and subtle failures are the hardest to diagnose. German forward observers were trained to trust their ears. Acoustic detection was not a backup system. It was foundational. Sound preceded sight. Sound preceded contact. Sound created time. That time began to vanish. In multiple sectors, armored encounters started without the usual auditory warning. Tanks appeared where they should have been heard minutes earlier. Not silent, but wrong. The familiar metallic percussion was gone, replaced by something softer, less distinct, blending into engine noise and environmental sound. The difference was not dramatic enough to trigger alarm. That was the trap. If American tanks had become completely silent, German units would have noticed immediately. Silence would have broken the rules too clearly. Instead, what disappeared was recognition. The sound profile had changed just enough to evade training. German observers did not hear nothing. They heard something that did not match the patterns they had been taught to identify as armor. And when sound does not match expectation, the brain hesitates. Hesitation is fatal. Reports began to surface describing phantom contacts, armor that seemed to appear without approach, units that arrived too close before detection. Forward observers questioned their own reports. Commanders questioned their men. Was the observer inexperienced? Was the weather distorting sound? Was fatigue setting in? No one suspected a method. No one suspected intention. Because from the German perspective, this kind of advantage required complex engineering, specialized materials, purpose-built systems, something that would leave obvious traces in intelligence reporting. None of that existed. Meanwhile, on the American side, the effect was becoming impossible to ignore. Tank crews noticed the difference immediately, even if they did not fully understand it. Vehicles sounded different, not quiet, but muted. The sharp edges of sound were gone. The clanking that had once announced movement now blended into a low, continuous rumble. More importantly, enemy response changed. Patrols moved closer before drawing fire. Reconnaissance runs reached positions that previously would have triggered flares or artillery. Crews reported passing near German positions without reaction. At first, these successes were treated cautiously. War is full of coincidences. Commanders do not gamble doctrine on luck, but repetition erodes skepticism. When the same effect occurs across multiple units, multiple routes, and multiple nights, coincidence becomes pattern, and pattern demands explanation. What made this situation unique was that the explanation did not come from engineers or planners. It came from experience, from crews who felt the difference beneath them, from maintenance personnel who had seen how the machine behaved after certain treatments. The method itself was not dramatic. There was no moment of revelation where someone realized they had unlocked a new weapon. The approach emerged incrementally, refined through repetition rather than design. It involved altering how metal interacted with metal, reducing friction, absorbing vibration, interrupting the transfer of impact energy that normally translated directly into sound, not eliminating noise, changing its character. This distinction matters more than silence ever could. German acoustic detection relied on specific auditory cues: sharp, metallic impacts, rhythmic clanking, familiar signatures that stood out against ambient noise. Those cues were not arbitrary. They were learned through years of exposure. When those cues disappeared, detection failed. The tanks did not need to be silent. They needed to be unfamiliar. That unfamiliarity created confusion. German prisoners captured during this period described uncertainty, not fear. They insisted no armor had passed their positions, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. Their confidence was genuine. They trusted their training. They had listened carefully. They simply had not heard what they expected. This is where the advantage became psychological. Once confidence in acoustic detection faltered, behavior changed. Units demanded visual confirmation. Patrols hesitated before reporting movement. Commanders delayed decisions while seeking additional information. Delay was the real weapon. American armor began operating in that gap, the window between expectation and realization. Tanks approached closer. Reconnaissance became bolder. Engagements began on American terms more often than before. No single action decided the outcome. The effect accumulated. Each undetected approach reinforced doubt. Each surprise contact eroded trust in the senses. Over time, German units began to treat silence not as safety, but as uncertainty. That uncertainty spread faster than any technical explanation. German technical intelligence did investigate. Captured vehicles were examined. Residue was noted. The composition was identified. But recognition came late, and implementation was impractical. By the time German analysts understood what had altered the sound profile, the conditions that allowed the advantage were already widespread. Winter terrain, operational tempo, supply limitations. Even knowing the method did not guarantee replication. This is another overlooked truth of warfare. Discovery does not equal capability. Understanding does not equal execution. American forces benefited not because the method was secret forever, but because it was simple enough to deploy quickly and mundane enough to be underestimated. The battlefield rarely rewards brilliance. It rewards timing. The moment of inversion, the true until, was not a single engagement or breakthrough. It was the realization that the enemy's most trusted early warning system had become unreliable. Once that realization spread, the psychological balance shifted. German commanders could no longer assume time. They could no longer trust distance. They could no longer rely on the belief that tanks announced themselves. The battlefield felt closer, smaller, more dangerous. American armor, meanwhile, gained confidence. Crews pushed limits. Patrols tested boundaries. The knowledge that detection was no longer guaranteed changed behavior more than any technical improvement ever could. This is the quiet truth behind many battlefield shifts. Technology matters less than what soldiers believe about it. When German units believed tanks were loud, they planned accordingly. When that belief failed, so did the plans built on it. The method itself remained unremarkable. It did not look like a weapon. It did not resemble innovation. It did not fit the image of technological superiority. And that is precisely why it worked. Engineers had dismissed it because it violated assumptions about what mattered. Commanders had ignored it because it did not promise dramatic results. Intelligence had missed it because it did not look like a breakthrough. But on the battlefield, results do not need to be dramatic. They need to be decisive. The tanks were not silent. The enemy simply never heard them coming. And by the time that truth became impossible to ignore, the advantage had already reshaped the fight. The real impact did not appear in after-action reports as a single victory or a decisive engagement. It appeared in behavior. Once acoustic certainty collapsed, everything built on it began to shift. German units did not suddenly lose the ability to fight. They lost the confidence to predict. And in war, prediction is survival. The moment commanders could no longer trust their ears, they were forced to compensate in other ways. They demanded more confirmation. They waited longer. They hesitated. Those hesitations multiplied. Forward observers began requesting visual confirmation before reporting armor. Patrols slowed, unsure whether silence meant absence or danger. Artillery units delayed fire missions that once would have been preemptive. Each delay was measured in minutes. Each minute narrowed the margin between warning and contact. American armor operated inside that shrinking margin. This was not a technological arms race. It was a behavioral one. The battlefield had not become quieter in absolute terms. It had become ambiguous. Ambiguity is corrosive to doctrine because doctrine depends on clarity. German defensive planning had been built around layered detection. Sound first, sight second, fire third. When the first layer failed, the entire structure weakened. The response was not collapse. It was overcompensation. Units began spreading out observers. Patrols increased. Visual checks replaced auditory ones. All of this consumed manpower and attention. Resources were pulled from other tasks to fill the gap left by unreliable sound. The irony was brutal. The more German units tried to restore certainty, the more predictable they became. American commanders noticed the change, even if they could not articulate it fully. Engagements began on more favorable terms. Reconnaissance penetrated deeper. Armor approached closer before triggering response. These were not spectacular breakthroughs. They were incremental advantages that accumulated over time. Incremental advantages win wars. Confidence among American crews grew, not bravado, assurance. The knowledge that detection was no longer guaranteed altered how crews thought about movement. Night operations expanded. Risk thresholds shifted. The battlefield felt less hostile, not because it was safer, but because it was less predictable for the enemy. Confidence changes posture. German units experienced the opposite effect. Silence, once comforting, became unsettling. Reports described quiet nights not as relief, but as tension. Soldiers listened harder. They strained to hear something familiar. When nothing came, uncertainty filled the gap. This psychological inversion mattered more than the mechanical effect itself. The German army had relied on sound not just as a sensor, but as reassurance. Noise meant time. Silence meant ignorance. That ignorance forced commanders to assume worst-case scenarios. Worst-case planning is expensive. It consumes resources and attention at an unsustainable rate. Meanwhile, American armor exploited the space between detection and response. Tanks did not charge recklessly. They moved deliberately, closer than before, using terrain and timing to maximize the confusion already present. The enemy was not blind. They were unsure. And uncertainty is harder to fight than visibility. Captured German reports from this period reflect a change in tone. Early documents express confidence in detection and response. Later ones express doubt, request clarification, and hedge conclusions. The language shifts from certainty to probability, from assertion to speculation. That shift is subtle, but it is decisive. Once commanders begin planning around probabilities instead of certainties, tempo slows. Opportunities shrink. Initiative transfers to the side willing to act. American units acted. The ripple effects extended beyond immediate engagements. Logistics adjusted. Supply routes were planned with greater caution. Defensive lines were reinforced in areas that previously relied on early warning. All of this redistributed German resources, thinning strength elsewhere. The battlefield did not reward the loudest force. It rewarded the force that disrupted expectation. This disruption also complicated intelligence. German analysts struggled to categorize what they were observing. Reports speculated about advanced materials, specialized dampening systems, or new engineering approaches. The assumption was that such effects required sophistication. That assumption delayed understanding. When intelligence frameworks expect complexity, they often miss simplicity. Analysts looked for research programs, industrial output, or design changes. They did not look for mundane adjustments, applied quietly and widely. By the time recognition occurred, replication was unrealistic. Even if the method was understood, implementing it across German units required resources they no longer possessed. Industrial capacity was strained, supply chains were fragmented, time was gone. American forces, by contrast, benefited from scale. Simplicity allowed rapid spread. A method that did not require redesign could be adopted quickly. It could be applied, reapplied, adjusted, and improved without waiting for approval. This difference mattered. Complex solutions are powerful, but slow. Simple solutions are fragile, but fast. In this case, speed won. The most enduring consequence was not technical. It was cultural. German doctrine had treated certain aspects of warfare as fixed. Sound was one of them. When that fixed point shifted, it exposed how much of doctrine depended on untested assumptions. American forces did not set out to challenge doctrine. They challenged necessity. The doctrine fell apart on its own. This is the uncomfortable lesson buried in the ripple effects. Military systems are optimized around beliefs. When those beliefs fail quietly, the system does not collapse immediately. It degrades. It hesitates. It loses coherence. The enemy does not need to be stronger. They only need to be unexpected. By early 1945, the effects were normalized on the American side. What had once been unusual became routine. Crews expected closer approaches. Commanders planned with confidence. Silence no longer signaled danger to one side and safety to the other. The battlefield had inverted. German units adapted as best they could. They relied more on sight. They increased patrols. They tightened discipline. But adaptation under pressure is never as effective as preparation. The window had passed. The ripple effects did not decide the war on their own. They did something quieter and more important. They altered the rhythm of engagement. They shifted initiative. They changed who reacted and who acted. And in modern warfare, initiative is everything. The most striking part is how little of this was visible in the moment. There was no announcement, no headline, no clear marker of change, only a gradual realization that the enemy seemed to arrive closer, sooner, and with fewer warnings than before. By the time German commanders fully understood that sound could no longer be trusted, the damage was already done. The battlefield had adapted around a new reality. Silence had not become a weapon. Uncertainty had. And uncertainty spread faster than any tank column ever could. Looking back, the method itself was never the most important part of this story. Soap was not a miracle. It did not defy physics. It did not make tanks invisible. It did not rewrite the laws of warfare. It simply exposed something far more dangerous than any weapon system, a blind spot in how military organizations think. Every army builds its doctrine around assumptions. These assumptions are rarely written down explicitly. They are absorbed through training, reinforced through experience, and rarely questioned once proven good enough. Over time, they harden into truths that feel as solid as steel. Noise was one of those truths. For decades, armored warfare accepted sound as inevitable. Engineers designed around it. Commanders planned around it. Soldiers learned to live with it. No one asked whether sound itself could be meaningfully altered without redesigning the machine, because the idea seemed pointless. Not impossible. Pointless. This distinction matters. Military history is full of ideas dismissed, not because they failed tests, but because they never seemed worth testing. Resources are finite. Attention is finite. Institutions choose what deserves curiosity. In this case, curiosity went elsewhere. Engineers pursued stronger armor, bigger guns, better engines. All impressive, all visible, all measurable. Sound, by contrast, was intangible, difficult to quantify, hard to optimize, and, most importantly, assumed to be unsolvable in any meaningful way, so it was ignored. The blind spot was not technological, it was conceptual. German doctrine was not flawed because it trusted acoustic detection. It was flawed because it trusted it absolutely. Sound became certainty. Certainty became comfort. Comfort became dependency. When that dependency was disrupted, the system struggled to adapt. This is the quiet danger of institutional confidence. The more reliable something feels, the less resilient it becomes when conditions change. Systems optimized for certainty are fragile when uncertainty appears. American forces did not deliberately target this blind spot. They stumbled into it. And that may be the most unsettling aspect of all. There was no grand plan to undermine German detection. No strategic directive to manipulate sound profiles. No research initiative focused on acoustic deception. The advantage emerged from practical problem-solving under pressure. This is how many battlefield shifts occur. Not through brilliance, but through necessity. Maintenance crews did not think like strategists. They thought like mechanics. They asked different questions. How do we make this last longer? How do we reduce wear? How do we survive the winter? They were not constrained by doctrine. They were constrained by reality. And reality does not care what doctrines assume. When the effect became visible, it spread not because it was elegant, but because it worked. Simplicity allowed speed. Mundanity allowed adoption. There was no need to convince skeptics with theory. Results did that work. The enemy, meanwhile, looked for sophistication. They searched for complexity. They assumed that meaningful change must look impressive. This assumption delayed understanding. In warfare, the most dangerous advantages are often the ones that do not look like advantages at all. They do not trigger alarms. They do not attract immediate attention. They operate beneath expectations. By the time they are recognized, behavior has already changed. The deeper lesson here is not about sound or soap or tanks. It is about how blind spots form and why they persist. Institutions become very good at solving the problems they expect to face. They become much worse at noticing problems they do not believe exist. German forces were prepared to counter loud armor. They were prepared to counter visible armor. They were not prepared to question the assumption that armor must announce itself. American forces benefited not because they were smarter, but because they were less constrained by that assumption. This difference shaped outcomes far beyond any single engagement. As the war moved toward its final phase, armored operations increasingly favored surprise, proximity, and initiative. These were not new concepts. What changed was how easily they could be achieved. The battlefield had not become quieter. It had become less predictable. And unpredictability favors the side willing to move first. After the war, engineers would analyze the method in technical terms. Friction coefficients, vibration absorption, boundary layers, all valid, all correct, all missing the point. The point was never chemistry. The point was that a system built on certainty collapsed when faced with ambiguity. German commanders believed they would hear tanks coming. They believed that belief itself. And when belief failed, reaction followed too slowly. In hindsight, it is tempting to romanticize this story as clever improvisation or underdog ingenuity. That misses the danger. The real threat is not that such blind spots exist. It is that they feel invisible until exploited. Every military, every institution, every system has assumptions. It no longer questions. Those assumptions define both strength and vulnerability. The soap track method did not win the war. It did something subtler and more enduring. It demonstrated that small, overlooked changes can undermine deeply trusted systems without ever announcing themselves. That is why this story still matters. Not because of what was done, but because of what no one thought to look for. And in warfare, what you fail to imagine often hurts you far more than what you prepare to fight. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. What part of this story challenged what you thought you knew about World War II? Share your thoughts in the comments, and check out the video on screen for another hidden story from the war.